footage that changed everything. The moment Karl-Anthony Towns looked into that camera with a championship smile, Anthony Edwards' entire situation in Minnesota suddenly felt different. Not because Ant said anything reckless, not because Cat took a shot at the Timberwolves, not because there was some fake beef waiting to explode online. It was bigger than that. It was quieter than that. It was the kind of NBA moment where one man's success forces an entire franchise to look in the mirror. Because not long ago, Towns and Edwards were supposed to be the future together. They were the fire and the foundation. KAT was the franchise star who had survived years of losing, criticism, roster changes, and disappointment in Minnesota. Edwards was the young superstar storming into the league with no fear, no filter, and no interest in waiting for permission. One carried the weight of the past, the other attacked the future like it owed him something. And somehow, it worked. Their relationship was never clean. That is what made it so magnetic. One day, Edwards was calling Towns his brother. The next day, he was challenging him in front of cameras. One moment, KAT was speaking emotionally about 9 years of sacrifice in Minnesota. The next moment, Ant leaned into the microphone and cut through the nostalgia with one viral line that told the whole league exactly who he was. Fans laughed. Analysts debated. Clips spread everywhere. But underneath the jokes and the tension, something real was happening. These were not two stars who hated each other. These were two competitors who pushed each other because they believed there was something bigger waiting on the other side. Then Minnesota broke it apart. When the Timberwolves traded Karl-Anthony Towns to the New York Knicks, it was sold as business. Salary, flexibility, roster balance, future planning, all the cold words front offices use when they make a decision that changes lives. But for Anthony Edwards, it was not just a transaction. It was losing the one-star big man who understood his game, opened the floor for him, and stood beside him through the rise of a franchise. And now, KAT is thriving somewhere else. That is why this story hits so hard. Because every time Edwards drives into traffic and sees two defenders waiting, people remember who used to pull those defenders away. Every time Towns shines in New York, Timberwolves fans wonder if Minnesota solved one problem by creating a bigger one. And every time footage of KAT and Ant resurfaces, the same question comes back louder. Did the Wolves break up the wrong partnership? Before we go deeper, drop your city in the comments. Where are you watching from right now? If you believe Minnesota made a mistake trading KAT, press 1. If you think Anthony Edwards can still lead the Timberwolves to a title without him, press 2. And if you love NBA stories like this, make sure you subscribe because this one is only getting more intense. When Minnesota had both stars, before the trade, before the headlines, before every old clip started feeling like evidence, there was a time when Minnesota had something most franchises spend decades trying to find. They had two stars who did not look alike, did not speak alike, did not lead alike, and somehow made each other more dangerous. Karl-Anthony Towns had already lived an entire basketball life in Minnesota before Anthony Edwards became the face of the next one. KAT knew the weight of being called the franchise cornerstone. He knew what it felt like to put up big numbers and still walk off the floor with another loss. He knew the interviews, the criticism, the questions about toughness, leadership, winning, and whether Minnesota would ever become more than a place where talent got stuck. Then Edwards arrived like a storm. He was young, explosive, confident, funny, fearless, and sometimes almost too honest for a league built on careful answers. Ant did not walk into Minnesota trying to quietly fit under Towns. He walked in like he believed the future was already his. For some veterans, that kind of energy can feel threatening. For KAT, it became something different. It became a spark. That was the beginning of what made this duo so fascinating. Towns gave Edwards structure. Edwards gave Towns edge. KAT stretched the floor, pulled big defenders away from the paint, and made Ant's drives more dangerous. Ant attacked defenses with a force Minnesota had not seen in years, and his confidence changed the emotional temperature of the team. Together, they gave the Timberwolves something they had been missing for a generation: belief. But belief does not always look calm. Their chemistry was loud. Their conversations were direct. Their body language sometimes looked intense enough to start an online debate before the game was even over. Edwards would challenge Towns. Towns would respond. They would argue, compete, laugh, and then go right back to trying to win together. That is why people kept watching them, not because it was clean, but because it felt real. Most NBA partnerships are polished for the cameras. Players say the right things, protect each other publicly, and keep the uncomfortable parts behind closed doors. KAT and Ant were different. When there was frustration, you could see it. When there was respect, you could see that too. And when they reached their best version, Minnesota suddenly looked like a real threat in the West. For years, the Timberwolves had been searching for an identity. With Towns and Edwards together, they finally had one. It was not perfect, it was not quiet, but it was alive. And that is what makes what happened next so painful. Because the partnership was not falling apart when Minnesota ended it. It was still evolving. It was still dangerous. It was still the kind of thing a franchise usually protects. Instead, the business side of the NBA stepped in. The viral tension was never simple. The internet loves a simple story. Two players argue, so they must hate each other. One player interrupts another, so there must be jealousy. A sideline exchange gets heated, so the locker room must be broken. But the truth about Anthony Edwards and Karl-Anthony Towns was never that easy. Their viral moments worked because they lived in the gray area. They were not fake. The tension was real. The emotion was real. The competitive fire was real. But so was the brotherhood. And that is what made every clip between them feel different from ordinary NBA drama. When Edwards challenged Towns publicly, it did not always sound like a young player talking to an established star with perfect respect. Sometimes it sounded raw, sometimes it sounded uncomfortable, sometimes it made people ask if Ant was crossing a line. But if you look closer, the message underneath was clear. He expected more because he believed KAT could give more. That kind of pressure only works when there is trust. You do not challenge a teammate like that if the relationship is empty. You challenge him because you know he can handle it. You challenge him because you think winning matters more than comfort. And in Minnesota, Edwards was never built to whisper when he believed something needed to be said. Towns, to his credit, did not run from that energy. He could have shut down. He could have treated Ant like a loud young player who had not earned the right to speak that way. Instead, he absorbed it. Sometimes he pushed back. Sometimes he laughed. Sometimes he let Edwards be Edwards because he understood something important. Minnesota needed that fire. For years, Towns had carried the burden of being the talented star on a team that could not fully break through. Edwards brought a different kind of pressure into the building, the kind that refused to accept losing as normal. That changed everything. The famous press conference moment after the Timberwolves' breakthrough playoff run captured the entire relationship in a few seconds. Towns was emotional, looking back at years of struggle. Edwards jumped in with the kind of blunt line only he could deliver, cutting through the past and dragging the room into the present. Fans laughed because it was funny, but it was deeper than comedy. KAT was remembering what Minnesota had survived. Ant was reminding everyone that survival was not the goal anymore. That was the difference between them. Towns carried history. Edwards chased the next conquest. One understood the pain of waiting. The other had no interest in waiting at all. And for a brief moment, that contrast gave Minnesota exactly what it needed. The tragedy is that those same differences, the ones that made them so electric, became easier to misread once they were no longer teammates. After the trade, every old clip changed, meaning what once looked like competitive brotherhood suddenly looked like warning signs. What once felt like fire started being replayed as fracture, but that misses the real story. They were not broken before the trade, they were intense, they were imperfect, they were emotional, but they were also building something. And in the NBA, not every powerful partnership looks peaceful from the outside. Some of the strongest ones are built in the heat. The season Minnesota finally believed. The 2023-24 season was the moment everything changed for the Timberwolves. For years, Minnesota had been treated like a franchise that could produce talent, but not destiny. They had stars before, they had hope before, they had stretches where fans convinced themselves maybe this time would be different. But too often, the ending was the same. Injuries, inconsistency, early exits, disappointment, and another summer of questions. Then Towns and Edwards pushed the team into a different conversation. Minnesota was no longer just interesting, they were dangerous, they defended with pride, they attacked with confidence. They played like a team that had finally stopped asking the league for respect and started taking it possession by possession. And at the center of that rise was the strange, powerful balance between Cat and Ant. Towns gave the offense something rare, a big man who could stretch the floor from deep, punish mismatches, attack slower defenders, and still rebound with size. His shooting was not just a bonus. It changed the entire geometry of the court. Every defender pulled toward him was one less body waiting for Edwards in the paint. And Edwards used that space like a superstar ready to announce himself. He drove with force. He talked with confidence. He took on playoff pressure like it was built for him. Suddenly, the rest of the league was watching Minnesota differently. The Wolves were not just a feel-good story, they were a problem. When they reached the Western Conference Finals, it felt like 2 decades of frustration finally cracked open. The city had waited, the fans had suffered through years of false starts. KAT had carried the weight of the franchise through seasons when the spotlight only came to ask why things were not working. And now, standing next to Edwards, he was finally part of a winning identity. That is why that moment mattered so much. It was not just a playoff run, it was proof. Proof that Towns could be part of a serious contender. Proof that Edwards could lead at the highest level. Proof that the Timberwolves had something real enough to scare people. But success in the NBA creates a dangerous kind of pressure. Once a team proves it can get close, the front office has to decide how much it is willing to sacrifice to get closer. Keep the core together and pay the price? Reshape the roster before the bill becomes too heavy? Trust chemistry? Or chase flexibility? Those are the questions that separate brave franchises from nervous ones. Minnesota looked at a team that had finally broken through and saw a financial problem coming. That is the part fans never forget. Because from the outside, it looked like the Wolves had just discovered their formula. Edwards as the explosive superstar. Towns as the skilled big who opened the floor. A defensive identity around a city finally believing again. Then, instead of running it back with the same emotional core, Minnesota chose a different path. Maybe the front office saw numbers, the fans did not. Maybe they feared the second apron. Maybe they believed the roster needed more toughness, more balance, more flexibility. In a vacuum, those arguments can make sense, but basketball is not played in a vacuum. It is played by people. And the people inside that locker room had just built something fragile, powerful, and unfinished. Then came the phone call that changed everything. The trade that hurt Edwards. When Karl-Anthony Towns was traded to the New York Knicks, the NBA saw a blockbuster deal, but Anthony Edwards saw something much more personal. To fans, it was about salary, contracts, roster balance, second apron pressure, Julius Randle, Dante DiVincenzo, and future flexibility. To Edwards, it was losing his brother. KAT was not just another teammate. He was the star big man who had been beside him during Minnesota's rise. The player who helped open the floor, absorb pressure, and turn the Timberwolves into a real threat in the West. That is why Ant's reaction felt so real. He understood the business side of the league, but understanding it did not make it painless. Towns had spent 9 years in Minnesota. Edwards had spent 4 seasons growing next to him. Together, they had helped the Timberwolves reach a place the franchise had not seen in 2 decades. Then suddenly, one phone call changed everything. And the hardest part was this. KAT did not force his way out. This was not a star demanding a trade. This was not a locker room collapse. This was Minnesota making a cold basketball decision and asking Edwards to keep moving forward without one of the people who helped him become who he was. After the trade, the basketball problem became obvious. Edwards was still brilliant, still explosive, still one of the most dangerous young stars in the NBA. But the floor felt different. Defenders could load up on him more easily. Double teams came faster. Driving lanes were tighter. The spacing that Towns created as a shooting big man was no longer there. That is when the trade stopped looking like just a financial move. It became a question of whether Minnesota truly understood what Edwards needed to win. Did they build around his strengths? Or did they simply expect his greatness to cover the holes? Did they trade away an expensive player? Or did they trade away the exact type of partner who made their franchise star harder to guard? For Edwards, that question did not need to be shouted. It showed up every night on the court. And while Minnesota was trying to prove it could survive without Towns, KAT was starting a new chapter in New York that would make the Wolves' decision look even more complicated. What Minnesota really lost? Minnesota did not just lose Karl-Anthony Towns' points and rebounds. They lost spacing, and for Anthony Edwards, that changed everything. With Towns on the floor, defenses had a problem. KAT could shoot from deep, attack mismatches, and pull big defenders away from the basket. That gave Edwards room to drive, space to create, and cleaner lanes to attack. It forced opponents to choose, protect the paint from Ant, or stay attached to Towns on the perimeter. Once KAT was gone, that choice became easier. Teams started loading up on Edwards. They sent help sooner. They crowded the lane. They dared other Timberwolves players to beat them. Every time Ant attacked the basket and ran into 2 defenders, the same truth appeared again. Minnesota had removed one of the best solutions to its own superstar's biggest problem. That is why the trade hurt on 2 levels. Emotionally, Edwards lost a brother. Strategically, he lost a perfect offensive partner. The front office had reasons. The second apron was real. Towns' contract was massive. The Wolves wanted flexibility, balance, and long-term control. Those arguments were not meaningless. But in the NBA, a move can make financial sense and still damage the basketball product. That is what Minnesota risked. Because Towns was not just any big man. He was one of the rare centers who could stretch the floor at an elite level. Players like that do not grow on trees. When you have a guard like Edwards, who lives by attacking downhill, a floor spacing big is not a luxury. It is a weapon, and once Towns started helping the Knicks, the contrast became painful. New York was using the same skill set Minnesota had given away. KAT was opening space for Jalen Brunson the way he once opened space for Edwards. The Knicks looked smoother, more dangerous, more complete. Meanwhile, Ant was still trying to break through defensive walls in Minnesota. That is when people started asking the uncomfortable question. Did the Timberwolves trade away the wrong piece? Maybe Minnesota can still fix it. Maybe they can add another creator, more shooting, and better answers for playoff defenses. But until they do, every double team Edwards faces will remind fans of the player who used to make those double teams harder to send. The Wolves did not just move a contract. They removed oxygen from their franchise star's offense. KAT's New York rebirth. New York was supposed to test Karl-Anthony Towns. Instead, it gave him a fresh start. For years, KAT had been judged through the weight of Minnesota's struggles. People questioned his toughness, his playoff impact, and whether his numbers truly translated to winning. But in New York, the story changed. He did not have to carry the full emotional history of a franchise anymore. He could play a clearer role beside Jalen Brunson and let his skill set speak. And it worked. Towns gave the Knicks something they badly needed: a big man who could score, stretch the floor, punish mismatches, and open driving lanes. Brunson now had more space to operate. Defenses had to respect KAT outside the paint. The same formula that once helped Edwards was now helping New York. That was the painful part for Minnesota. KAT did not leave and disappear. He left and reminded everyone exactly how valuable he still was. Every strong Knicks performance made the Timberwolves' decision harder to defend. Every big playoff moment became another reason fans wondered if Minnesota had underestimated what he gave them. But Towns never turned the story ugly. He did not attack Edwards. He did not try to embarrass Minnesota. He simply won, played well, and showed gratitude. That made his rise even more powerful. Sometimes the loudest response is not revenge. Sometimes it is success. Meanwhile, Edwards was still in Minnesota, still carrying huge expectations, still trying to prove the Wolves could win without KAT, but the comparison was impossible to ignore. Towns had found a system that unlocked him. Edwards was still waiting for Minnesota to fully solve the problems Towns used to help solve. And yet, the bond between them stayed strong. That is what separated this story from ordinary NBA drama. The media could chase tension. Fans could search for hidden shots. But KAT and Ant never truly became enemies. Towns still called Edwards his brother. Edwards still respected Towns. Their relationship survived the business decision that split them apart. That made the story more emotional. Because Cat's success was not just a basketball story. It was proof that the partnership Minnesota broke up still had real value. It was proof that Towns could thrive in the right structure. And it was proof that Edwards had lost more than a teammate. He had lost a piece of the formula. Brotherhood after the breakup. The NBA can trade players, change jerseys, and separate teammates overnight. But it cannot always erase brotherhood. That is what made the Towns and Edwards story different. After KAT left Minnesota, people expected tension. They expected jealousy. They expected Ant to feel bitter watching Towns succeed in New York. They expected the old heated clips to turn into proof that the relationship was always broken. But that was not the truth. Their bond remained real. Towns still spoke about Edwards with love. Edwards still supported him from a distance. Even after the trade, even after their careers moved in different directions, there was no public betrayal between them. The business side of the NBA separated them on the court, but it did not destroy what they built off it. That is why the FaceTime moment mattered. When Towns reached a major moment in New York, he still wanted to connect with Edwards. That said everything. He did not forget the teammate who pushed him, challenged him, and helped shape him. And Ant, even while dealing with his own frustration in Minnesota, still had respect for the man he called his brother. That is the human side of this story. Fans often talk about players like contracts, assets, and trade pieces, but players live these decisions. They build relationships. They go through pressure together. They lose together, win together, argue together, and grow together. KAT and Ant had all of that. Their relationship was never quiet. It was loud, competitive, emotional, and sometimes uncomfortable. But that did not mean it was fake. In fact, the heat was part of the connection. Edwards challenged Towns because he believed in him. Towns accepted Ant's fire because he understood what Minnesota needed. They cared loudly. That is why the old clips hit differently now. The arguments were not just tension. The jokes were not just jokes. The interruptions were not just viral moments. They were signs of a relationship built on honesty, competition, and trust. But for Minnesota, that also makes the trade more complicated. The Wolves did not just remove a basketball fit. They removed someone who mattered deeply to their franchise player. They broke up a partnership that had helped create the team's identity. And now they have to prove to Edwards that they can replace not only Towns' production, but also the belief he brought to the locker room. That will not be easy, because talent can be replaced on paper. Trust is harder. Minnesota's warning sign: the Timberwolves are not in full crisis yet, but they cannot ignore the warning sign. Anthony Edwards has not demanded a trade. he has not turned against Minnesota. People close to him have pushed back against rumors and made it clear that he still values the team in the city. But in the NBA, superstar frustration usually starts quietly before it becomes loud. It starts with roster question. It starts with playoff disappointment. It starts when insiders say other teams are watching. And it starts when a young superstar keeps producing at an elite level, but the team around him keeps running into the same ceiling. That is the danger for Minnesota. Edwards is good enough to be the face of a championship team. He is young, explosive, fearless, and already one of the league's most exciting stars. Players like him are almost impossible to find. When a franchise has that kind of player, every decision must be about proving one thing: we can help you win here. Right now, the Wolves still have to prove that. The KAT trade created pressure because Minnesota broke up a formula that had already reached the Western Conference Finals. Maybe the formula was expensive. Maybe it was imperfect. Maybe the front office had legitimate financial concerns. But it was real. And after Towns left, Edwards' job became harder in obvious ways. He needs more spacing. He needs another creator. He needs teammates who can punish loaded defenses. He needs a roster that makes playoff basketball easier, not heavier. If Minnesota cannot provide that, the questions will only grow. Because rival teams are always waiting. The moment a superstar looks even slightly uncertain, front offices start preparing offers. They may not say it publicly, but everyone knows how this league works. Stars rarely become available overnight. The situation builds slowly, one frustrating season at a time. That is why Minnesota has to act before the noise becomes real. They cannot just manage the salary cap and call it progress. They cannot expect Edwards to carry every offensive problem by himself. They cannot point to past success while the team's ceiling feels lower than it should. The front office must make moves that matter, not moves that only save money. Not moves that only look responsible on paper, real moves. Moves that change what happens when Edwards drives into the paint and sees two defenders waiting. Moves that show him the organization is chasing a championship, not just avoiding financial pain. Because Edwards may love Minnesota, but love still needs proof. And if the Wolves do not give him that proof soon, the same franchise that once lost Towns could eventually face a much bigger problem with the superstar who stayed. The final lesson. The Karl-Anthony Towns and Anthony Edwards story was never just about a trade. It was about business, brotherhood, and the cost of breaking up something that still had life. Minnesota had reasons to move Towns. His contract was huge, the second apron was real, the front office wanted flexibility. But basketball is not only math, it is chemistry, spacing, trust, and timing. To the Timberwolves, KAT was a contract decision. To Edwards, he was a brother and the big man who made the floor easier for him. That difference matters. Now Minnesota has one job. Prove to Edwards that trading KAT was not the beginning of the end. They need more spacing, another creator, and real playoff answers when defenses load up on Ant. Words will not be enough. He needs proof. For Towns, New York became a fresh start. He showed that a player can leave without bitterness, win somewhere else, and still respect the people who helped shape him. His bond with Edwards survived the business. That is the human lesson. Trades change teams. They do not always destroy relationships. Now, KAT has his new chapter. Edwards has Minnesota on his shoulders. And the Timberwolves have to show they still know how to build around their superstar. If they get it right, this becomes a painful but necessary turning point. If they get it wrong, this trade may be remembered as the first warning sign. So what do you think? If Minnesota made a mistake trading Cat, press 1. If you still believe Edwards can win a title with the Wolves, press 2. If you respect the brotherhood between KAT and Ant, press 3. Like the video, share it with another NBA fan, and subscribe for more NBA stories where basketball, business, and real emotion collide.